The entire auction hall went quiet. The moment the covered item was rolled through the side entrance. Not the polite quiet of a room waiting for a speaker. The kind of quiet that happens when 200 people realize something is wrong. The moving dolly carrying the piece was visibly unsteady. One wheel had seized. The two handlers struggling with it exchanged a look that said everything. When they finally pulled the canvas tarp away, an older gentleman near the front actually laughed. Not cruelly, just reflexively. The way people laugh when they're surprised by something worse than expected. What sat on the platform was a Steinway Model D concert grand piano, or what had once been one. The lid was split down the center, a crack running the full length of the lacquered ebony, like a fault line after an earthquake. 3 of the legs had been replaced at some point with mismatched supports that didn't belong to the instrument. The keys, what remained of them, were yellowed, chipped, several missing entirely. Someone had wrapped the lower frame in packing tape at some point, perhaps to keep it together during a previous move. The tape had dried and curled away, leaving a sticky residue, and a patch of discoloration across the base. An appraiser from the estate company leaned toward the microphone and cleared his throat. "This piece was recovered from the Caldwell estate inventory," he said carefully. "Given the extent of the damage, we've assessed it as decorative only, non-functional. We recommend bidding begin at salvage value." The murmuring started. Across the room, standing near the back wall, with a catalog tucked under his arm and a styrofoam cup of cold coffee in his hand, a man named Stuart Calloway said nothing. He just looked at the piano. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize when they had no business recognizing it. Stuart was 43 years old. He stood a little under 6 feet, wore a canvas jacket that had seen better years, and had the kind of hands that told a story before he opened his mouth. Thick at the knuckles, scarred along 2 fingers on the right, permanently stained near the nail beds, in a way that's soap never fully fixed. He had driven 4 hours from Asheville, North Carolina, to attend this estate auction in Richmond, Virginia. He had not planned to bid on a piano. He set his coffee down on the windowsill. He walked toward the platform. One of the handlers stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, the piece hasn't been released for handling yet." "I'm not touching it," Stuart said. "I just want to look." He stood in front of the damaged Steinway for almost 2 full minutes. The auction had paused awkwardly around him. People waited. A woman behind him whispered something to her companion. The appraiser shuffled papers. Stuart crouched down slightly and looked at the cast iron plate, visible through a gap in the damaged lid. He tilted his head. He stood back up. Then, in a voice quiet enough that only the people nearest him heard it, he said, "I know this piano." Nobody understood what that meant. Most people went back to their catalogs. But Stuart Calloway had just said the truest sentence he'd spoken in 3 years. He had grown up, watching his father restore things. The workshop behind their house in rural Tennessee was a cathedral of broken objects. Clocks with missing hands, furniture with collapsed joints. Once, memorably, a player piano that arrived in 7 boxes from a church that was being demolished, and that his father spent 14 months returning to working condition. Stuart grew up handing over tools before he knew their names, learning the difference between patient work and rushed work by the simple measure of which one held. His father, Raymond Calloway, had a saying: "A broken thing isn't a dead thing. It just needs someone willing to be honest with it." Stuart became a piano technician and restoration specialist. He was considered exceptional at the work. Not merely competent, but genuinely gifted. By his early 30s he had restored instruments for 2 symphony orchestras and a private collection in Charleston that was frequently cited in musicology journals. His name appeared, quietly and without fanfare, in the acknowledgement sections of 3 books about American concert piano history. Then his wife, Margot, was diagnosed. The illness moved faster than any of the doctors predicted. Glioblastoma, the kind that doesn't negotiate. They had 22 months from diagnosis to the morning. Stuart sat in a hospital chair in Knoxville, holding her hand as she stopped breathing. Their son, Owen, was 7 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his father's tendency toward silence. After Margot died, Stuart's workshop became a place he walked past, not into. The clients stopped calling eventually. Not unkindly, they understood the circumstances, but work requires showing up, and for a long time Stuart simply couldn't. The savings ran down. He sold the house with the workshop, and moved into a rental in Asheville with Owen, who by then was 9, and had developed a habit of leaving small drawings on the kitchen table in the mornings. Birds, mostly, and what appeared to be abstract maps of places that didn't exist. Stewart took whatever work came. He repaired a few upright pianos for local music teachers. He tuned instruments for a community college music department at a rate that covered groceries, but not much else. He told himself he was taking it slow. He told himself he'd get back to real work soon. He told himself that for almost 3 years, the week before the Richmond auction, Owen had shown him a drawing of a large bird, with its wings fully spread, standing in front of what was unmistakably a piano. Stewart had looked at it for a long time. Owen, who was now 10, and had inherited his mother's habit of saying more with a look than most people said with paragraphs, simply watched his father hold the paper. "Is that supposed to be something?" Stewart asked. "Yeah," Owen said. "What?" Owen shrugged. "You." Stewart drove to Richmond the next morning. He bid $40 on the Steinway. He was the only bidder. The estate appraiser looked at him with something between pity and professional neutrality as Stewart filled out the paperwork. A woman from a furniture liquidation company, who had been eyeing the instrument for its decorative value, a piano-shaped object for a hotel lobby, perhaps, never to be played, had stepped away when she realized the piece was more damaged than it appeared at distance. $40 and 4 hours of driving, and the cost of renting a trailer large enough to transport a concert grand. Stewart's friend Hugh Darden, who owned a body shop in Black Mountain, and owed Stewart approximately 7 years' worth of favors, for reasons too complicated to summarize, drove the trailer. He walked around the piano once after they got it loaded, then looked at Stewart. "What are you going to do with that?" Hugh asked. "Fix it," Stewart said. Hugh looked at the split lid, the missing keys, the mismatched legs, the packing tape residue. "Stewart," Hugh said, "I know, that's not fixable. I know what it looks like." "Then what?" "Just drive, Hugh." Hugh drove. They brought the piano into the garage bay of Stewart's rental house, which was technically not zoned for workshop use, and which Stewart had converted into a workspace by moving Owen's bicycle outside and hanging 2 additional work lights from the ceiling joists. He spent the first evening doing nothing but assessment. He removed the damaged lid carefully and documented every fracture point. He examined the cast iron plate, which was, remarkably, structurally intact. Hairline stress marks but nothing compromised. He checked the pin block. He tested the action mechanism on the keys that remained. He ran his thumb along the soundboard and held very still, listening to the way the vibration moved or didn't. Owen came out at 9 o'clock with a glass of water and set it on the workbench without saying anything. He sat on an overturned crate and watched his father work. This had been their pattern since Asheville. Owen did homework in whatever room Stewart was working in. He didn't demand conversation, he just stayed close in the way that children sometimes do when they understand, without being able to articulate it, that presence matters more than words. "Is it bad?" Owen asked after a while. Stewart thought about it. "The outside is bad," he said. "The inside is complicated." "Complicated good or complicated bad?" Stewart ran his hand along the pin block again. "Complicated interesting." Owen considered this, like a puzzle. Like 20 puzzles stacked on top of each other. Owen nodded as though that settled something. He finished his water and went to bed. Stewart stayed in the garage until 2 in the morning. The next 3 weeks were research. Stewart knew the piano was a Steinway Model D, the concert grand, the largest and most demanding instrument the company produced, built for performance halls and professional stages. He had worked on 2 others in his career, both for orchestra clients, with budgets that accommodated the work. The Model D was not a forgiving instrument to restore. Its complexity was architectural in scale, more than 12,000 individual parts, a soundboard requiring specialized expertise to assess, a plate that, if cracked, rendered the instrument effectively unrepairable. The plate was intact. That was the first stroke of luck. He began pulling the serial number from the cast iron, and ran it through the Steinway archive database. He expected to find a manufacture date in the 1980s. Perhaps a touring instrument that had been poorly stored after its performing life ended. What he found instead was a manufacture date of 1962. He sat in front of his laptop screen for a long time. A 1962 Steinway Model D in functional condition was not merely valuable in a financial sense, it was a piece of history. The mid-century Steinways, particularly the concert grands, were considered by many pianists and technicians to be among the finest examples of American piano manufacturing ever produced, built before certain material and production changes that came in later decades. If this instrument could be restored, genuinely restored, not cosmetically patched, it would be significant in a way that Stewart's work hadn't been since before Margot died. He cross-referenced the serial number against a secondary archive. The piano had a performance history. It had been owned by a small touring company out of Boston in the 1960s and 1970s, used for regional concert performances across the eastern seaboard. It had passed through 2 private owners before being acquired by the Caldwell estate in Virginia, where it had apparently been sitting in a poorly climate-controlled storage annex for the better part of 2 decades. 20 years of bad storage, a transport accident at some point, the split lid suggested impact damage, humidity cycles that had warped and cracked components throughout the case, and yet the plate was intact. And the soundboard, when Stewart tapped it carefully and listened, still had resonance. Damaged resonance, yes, but real. He called Hugh at 11 that night. "I need to tell you something about the piano," Stewart said. "Is this going to cost me money?" Hugh asked. "It's going to cost me money, a lot of it. I need to know if you still have that climate-controlled bay at the shop." A pause. "Stewart, I know, you don't have clients right now. You don't have. I know that, Hugh." Another pause. "How much of a story is this?" "I don't know yet, maybe nothing, maybe the biggest piece I've ever touched." Hugh was quiet for a moment. "Bay 3 is empty. Bring it tomorrow." The work began in earnest in October. Owen took to stopping by Hugh's shop after school before Stewart picked him up. Hugh's shop had become a second home of sorts. 3 other mechanics worked there, all of whom had informally adopted Owen, in the way that adults in working spaces sometimes adopt quiet children who stay out of the way, and occasionally hand you the right tool before you ask for it. Owen turned out to have a mechanical memory that impressed even Hugh. By November he could name most of the parts of the piano's action mechanism, not because Stewart had explicitly taught him, but because he'd been listening to his father talk to himself while working. The lid required entirely new wood. Stewart sourced Sitka spruce from a specialty supplier in Oregon that he'd worked with years earlier, before everything fell apart. He hand-shaped the replacement sections over 2 weeks, matching the grain and figure as closely as possible to the original ebony laminate. The finishing work alone, getting the color and sheen to read as continuous rather than repaired, took 12 days. The keys were a separate project. Of the 88 keys on a concert grand, Stewart recovered 61 that were repairable. The remaining 27 required replacement key blanks, which he sourced from a piano parts supplier in Chicago. He fitted each one individually, weighting and voicing each key action to match the response of the surviving originals. The soundboard had 3 separate cracks. Repairing a soundboard was, as Stewart had explained to Owen during one late evening session, essentially like performing surgery on the instrument's lung. The vibrating surface was what gave the piano its voice, its fundamental character, the quality that made one instrument sound unlike any other. You didn't replace a soundboard if you could possibly avoid it. You repaired it, reinforced it, and listened constantly to whether you were restoring the voice or changing it into something foreign. He worked slowly. More slowly than the clock or the budget encouraged. There were nights, when he sat back from the instrument, and felt the weight of everything that had stopped when Margot died. The career left half-built. The clients who had moved on. The version of himself that used to walk into a room and know exactly what a damaged instrument needed. He was no longer sure he was that person. He was a man in a borrowed bay at his friend's body shop, working on a piano nobody else had wanted, with $12 left in his checking account after buying replacement tuning pins. One evening Owen found him sitting on an upturned bucket beside the piano, not working, just sitting. Owen sat down on the floor next to him. He had a granola bar, which he split in half, and handed the larger piece to his father without comment. They sat there for a while, the two of them, in the quiet of the shop after hours. "Do you think about Mom when you work on it?" Owen asked. Stewart took a breath. "Yeah, is that bad?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It feels like she's in the room. Like she's watching to see if I'm going to do it right." Owen looked at the piano. "She would want you to do it right," "Yeah, so do it right." Owen ate the rest of his granola bar and went back to his homework. Stuart picked up his tools. He didn't realize the restoration had been noticed until a technician from the Southeastern Piano Association stopped by Hugh's shop in January, claiming to need a vehicle repair, and then spent 45 minutes standing next to the Steinway while Hugh changed his oil. The man's name was Peter Finch. He was in his 60s, semi-retired, and had the kind of credentials that Stuart recognized even if he didn't follow the circuit anymore. Peter circled the piano twice without speaking. He ran his hand along the re-lacquered lid. He pressed 4 keys and listened. "What serial is this?" he asked. Stuart told him. Peter went still. "This is the Caldwell piano. You know it?" "I know of it. People thought it was destroyed." Peter pressed another key. "Where did you find it?" "Estate auction in Richmond, $40. Peter looked at him for a long time. "Who are you?" Stuart told him that too. Something shifted in Peter's expression, recognition, and then something more complicated. "Raymond Calloway's son," he said. "I saw your father work once, in Memphis, must have been 1987. He restored a Bosterfer for a traveling company." He paused. "You have his hands." Stuart didn't know what to say to that. "Who's this restoration for?" Peter asked. "Right now me." Peter looked at the piano again. "There's a recital at the Worthington Center in March, in Charlotte. The guest pianist is Adrian Lacey." He said the name the way people say a name they expect to be recognized. Stuart recognized it. Lacey was one of the most respected American concert pianists of the past 20 years, known particularly for performing on historic instruments when she could source them. She's been looking for a historically significant instrument for the closing concert. Peter continued. "The House Steinway is a 2007, perfectly serviceable, nothing special." Stuart looked at the piano. "I can't promise it'll be finished in time," he said. "Can you promise it'll be honest?" He understood what Peter meant. Not perfect, not showroom, but real, the instrument telling the truth about what it was, and what it had survived. "Yeah," Stuart said, "I can promise that." Peter nodded once. "I'll make a call." The next 6 weeks were the hardest and the best Stuart had done since before Margot died. He stopped sleeping much. Owen started setting an alarm to bring his father coffee in the morning, because he noticed Stuart kept forgetting to make it. Hugh quietly extended the bay rental indefinitely. And stopped asking about payment. The 3 shop mechanics started staying a few minutes later than their shifts ended. Not to help, exactly, but to be around, in the way that people gather near something they can feel is becoming important. Stuart refinished the case in the original ebony lacquer, building up 12 coats over 3 weeks, and cutting between each application. He regulated the entire action, adjusting the height, weight, and response of all 88 keys, until the mechanical feel matched the playability specifications of the Steinway archive documentation. He voiced the hammers by hand, needling each felt surface to achieve the tonal balance that a concert grand required. Bright in the upper register, full and complex in the lower, with a middle range that allowed the pianist to color each note individually. The final tuning took 2 full days. Stuart tuned the piano 4 times through, letting the strings settle between each pass. On the 4th tuning, he sat down on the bench, a thing he had not done consciously or unconsciously until that moment, and played a scazel. The sound that came back filled the bay. Not perfectly. There were imperfections, small voicing inconsistencies he hadn't resolved, a slight unevenness in one section of the treble that he knew about, and planned to address. But the fundamental voice of the instrument, the quality that was either there or wasn't, that no amount of technical work could manufacture if the instrument itself didn't have it, was unmistakably present. It sounded like a piano that had been alive for 60 years and had survived something and hadn't let that survival make it smaller. Hugh had walked in at some point during the scale. He was standing near the door when Stuart looked up. "Is that it?" Hugh asked. "Not quite. Another few days," Hugh nodded. He stood there a moment. "It sounds different than I thought it would." "Different how?" Hugh thought about it. "Bigger," he said. "Like it's been waiting." The Worthington Center in Charlotte seated 800 people. On the evening of the recital, approximately 650 of those seats were filled. It was a strong audience for a mid-season concert. The program had been announced as a historical instruments evening, with Lacey performing works by Chopin, Brahms, and one American composer Stuart didn't know. The restored Steinway sat at center stage beneath the performance lighting, and even from the back of the hall where Stewart was standing, he had declined a seat, somewhat irrationally. It looked extraordinary. The ebony lacquer caught the light differently than a modern piano. Older, somehow. More present. Owen was sitting in the fourth row, with Peter Finch, who had arranged the tickets and who had taken something like a proprietary interest in the evening. Owen had worn the blue shirt that Margot had bought him for school picture day 2 years ago, which he insisted on because he was 11 now, and had opinions about things. It fit him differently than it had. He was growing. Adrienne Lacey walked on stage and the audience applauded. She was in her mid-50s, unhurried in the way of people who had spent their lives in concert halls and had made a private peace with public attention. She sat at the piano, she adjusted the bench. She looked at the keys for a moment, which Stewart watched, and could not fully interpret from the back of the hall. She played. He had expected to be anxious. He had expected to be monitoring the instrument's sound critically, listening for the voicing inconsistency in the treble, evaluating and second-guessing. Instead he found that he simply listened. The Chopin came first, 2 nocturnes, and the piano's voice moved through the hall with a warmth and complexity that he hadn't been fully able to hear in Hugh's shop. The resonance required the space, required the acoustic environment a concert hall provided, to reveal itself completely. Beside him near the back, a woman he didn't know leaned toward her companion and said something in a low voice that Stewart didn't catch. Her companion nodded and said, quietly, "The piano." At the intermission Peter found him. "She wants to meet you," Peter said. Stewart followed him backstage. Adrienne Lacey was standing near the piano with a glass of water, talking to the Worthington's artistic director. When she saw Stewart, she finished her sentence and walked over. "You restored this instrument," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, where was it?" he told her briefly. "The estate auction, the $40, the Asheville garage, Hugh's shop." She looked at him with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating things. "I've played a lot of pianos," she said. "Restored instruments sometimes feel like museums, like you're playing something preserved under glass." She paused. "This one doesn't feel like that, it feels like it wants to be played." Stewart didn't know what to say. "The soundboard," she said. "You repaired it rather than replaced it." "Yes, that's why." She looked back at the piano for a moment. Most technicians would have replaced it. It would have been easier. The result would have been technically acceptable. She said the word acceptable in a way that made clear what she thought of acceptable. "What made you decide to keep it?" He thought about how to answer that. "Because the original voice was still there," he said. "It was damaged, but it wasn't gone, and a replacement soundboard would have been a different piano. A good piano, but not this one." She studied him. "You learned that from someone, my father." She nodded slowly. "There's an organization," she said. "The American Heritage Instruments Foundation. They fund the restoration of historically significant instruments. The ones that fall between categories, too damaged for private collectors, not famous enough for institutional donors. They've been looking for a lead technician for a new restoration program for about a year." She paused. "The position would be based wherever the technician is. The work would travel. It would mean taking on instruments that most people would say are beyond saving." The phrase landed in the air between them. She said it plainly, without drama. "I sit on their advisory board. I've seen 3 candidates for the position in the past year. None of them did what you did tonight." She gestured toward the stage. "They would have replaced the soundboard." Stewart was quiet for a moment. "I have a son," he said. "He's 11. I can't travel constantly." The program was designed with that in mind. The previous director had the same concern. She looked at him with a kind of steady patience that reminded him, oddly and suddenly, of Margot. "It's a real job," she said, "with a salary and benefits and a budget for materials. The instruments would come to you when possible, you would travel when necessary." From somewhere beyond the backstage curtain, he could hear the audience returning to their seats. The second half of the program was about to begin. "The program," she said. "We were going to name it after the foundation's original donor. But the board has been discussing renaming it for the past several months." She paused. "If you take the position, we'd like to name it after someone you choose." He understood, somehow, before she finished the sentence. In the fourth row, Owen was settling back into his seat next to Peter, holding what appeared to be a program booklet that he'd fold into an origami shape during intermission, a habit his mother had taught him on a rainy afternoon in Knoxville when Owen was 4 years old, and Margot was still there. Stuart looked at the piano. He thought about a workshop in Tennessee, and a man who said that a broken thing isn't a dead thing. He thought about 12 coats of lacquer, and 61 recoverable keys and a soundboard that still had a voice, even after 20 years of being left in the dark. He thought about a drawing of a bird standing in front of a piano, left on a kitchen table by a 10-year-old boy who saw something his father hadn't been able to see yet. He thought about Margot. The Margot Calloway Restoration Program, he said. His voice was steady. He was a little surprised by that. Adrian Lacey nodded once. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile and did not need to be. "I'll be in touch Monday," she said, and walked back on stage. The second half began moments later. Stuart walked back through the hall and found his way to the seat Peter had saved beside Owen. Owen looked up when he sat down, evaluated his father's expression with the thoroughness of a child who had learned to read adults carefully and early, and apparently concluded that, whatever had happened backstage was good. He leaned over and said, very quietly so as not to disturb the people around them, "Well, I'll tell you after," Stuart said. Owen looked at the piano on the stage. Then he looked back at his father. "You fixed it," he said, not a question, not about the piano. The lights dimmed, the hall went quiet, and from the restored Steinway, a 62-year-old instrument that 4 different people had declared beyond saving, that had spent 2 decades forgotten in a storage annex, that had been sold at auction for $40. Adrian Lacey began to play. The sound moved through the hall the way sound does when it has somewhere to go, and something to say. Stuart Calloway closed his eyes and listened. If you've ever been told that something you cared about was past saving, leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.